The Big Split. By Anna von Reitz. Information provided to H.E. Cardinal Mamberti and the Vatican Chancery Court in regard to our claims, March 5, 2005, January 19, 2023, in Sikh. The Big Split came when the Roman Empire split in two, East and West, and the Western Empire sank into a decline, while their counterparts in Byzantium enjoyed vastly increased fortunes, both materially and diplomatically. The impact of this schism is still felt today, and also the impact of the secret alliance between the bishops of Rome and the Patriarchs. While they seem worlds apart, both East and West are speaking for the same universal church, and they collaborate to their mutual benefit, similar to the two giant municipal corporations housed in the District of Columbia, appearing to be different and under different management, while both are following a single game plan. We don't even study or talk about the Ottoman Empire in Western schools anymore, but it spanned from 1299 to 1922, and was the government for millions of Muslim people in multiple countries. Its holdings ran from North Africa to the Arctic Circle and from Iraq to the Balkans. It stood in the direct path of trade between China and the West and became immensely wealthy as a middleman. It was considered the greatest threat to Christianity that ever existed. The Eastern Church was the recipient of many gifts from the vast Ottoman Empire, which it ultimately undermined and destroyed. Largely unmarked by the Western countries, huge reserves of gold, jewels, and other riches piled into Constantinople as the Ottoman Empire faded, and for the most part, those treasures stayed there under church control, because the church surreptitiously controlled the banks. This idea of controlling nations by controlling their money and exercising coercive regulatory control of their banks comes straight from Constantinople. The Eastern Church's control over the banks developed out of its secular role as the government of Byzantium, a city-state. It's thanks to them that we have bank commissions and at least purported public oversight of banking operations. They also brought us the handy artifice known as a claim on abandonment and associated fraud schemes. Employment of both these devices, unseen regulatory control of banks and claims on abandonment, would be crucial to the success of the municipal corporations in their present schemes, too, except that they've been caught red-handed. The Eastern Church undermined the Ottoman Empire for their religious differences, and it gained de facto control of much of the Ottoman Empire's wealth via its unseen regulatory manipulation of the banks. Efforts to resolve this untenable situation eventually fell upon Archduke Ferdinand, whose subsequent assassination sparked the First World War. Working behind the giant smokescreen created by the First World War, the Eastern Church's claims on abandonment succeeded, and much of the wealth of the world from the Middle East to the Balkan states disappeared into its coffers without a whisper. It was the biggest heist in history, and nobody heard a word about it. British efforts to take over the landmass of the Ottoman Empire failed, but the Eastern Church's successful bank fraud made it all worthwhile. The same basic plan was implemented again in World War II, only this time, the target was all the American gold that had been removed to the Philippine Islands for safekeeping by the U.S. Navy. A significant portion of this hoard was subsequently discovered and carted off by Japanese General Yamashita, leading to the myth of Yamashita's gold. Again, false claims on abandonment and unknown origins were used as the excuse for bank fraud, and again, it was pulled off behind the smokescreen of a war, the Second World War. It was the second biggest heist in world history, and again, nobody caught on. We are coming up on our third iteration of mammoth theft promoted via false claims on abandonment, and the perpetrators are again trying to whip up World War III to provide the smokescreen for it. This time, the target is nothing less than all the land that has been secretly and unlawfully occupied by the territorial Commonwealth mercenaries. The white-collar criminals propose that all this land is abandoned by the respective national governments, and free for the phony custodians to claim for themselves. They propose to run this instant empire via the United Nations organization, while using the Nazi Uncorp to rule it. Of course, they and their collaborators running all the various franchises like Australia, Inc. and Australia, have voted for this outcome and have misrepresented this as 179 nations approved this, when in fact, 179 self-interested and criminal commercial corporations approved it for their own benefit. The actual nations made up of living people haven't been consulted. In the scheme promoted by the municipal corporations, we are to be considered assets of the new corporate feudalism and farmed like animals, with eugenists making decisions about which DNA gets passed on and which DNA hits the dustbin of history. Forget about such concepts as love and freedom, according to them. One of the lessons learned from the big split of the church into East and West were the many advantages of having two sides to everything, always having a good cop to counterbalance the bad cop, always having a convenient enemy to attack, and extra unsuspected hands ready to carry away the loot. We see this same purposeful setup of two sides to everything in all sorts of venues. The same perpetrators who brought us all this fun and games set up the concept of Palestine, and then set up the concept of Israel in the Middle East as a beachhead for their commercial activities and political meddling. The entire Middle Eastern conflict was set up with malice aforethought by central bankers and criminal municipal corporations, and this is not the first time. They set up the Prussian Empire, as opposed to the Prussian Kingdom, in exactly the same way, and for the same basic purposes. One must have two sides to divide and conquer. It's easier to do, if you set up both sides yourself. Beginning in the 1700s, these same offenders created a network of secret societies, most especially, the Freemasons, and taught the same principles to them, though they dressed it up with arcane semi-biblical doggerel and taught their initiates that this two sides to everything program reflects the two entrance pillars to Solomon's temple, Joachim and Boaz. Other secret societies teach that these are not pillars, but goads, right and left, to herd people the same way a farmer uses a staff to herd pigs and goats. A less sanctimonious and more truthful explanation. The Ottoman horde was quickly renamed the Eastern Church's horde to disguise what it was and where it came from, and the Roman Church, owing to its closer position and ties to the war-torn lands of Western Europe, became the banker and facilitator of choice. The Vatican Bank had already existed for centuries, but the version we now know was birthed in the cruel aftermath of the First World War, when a lot of money was made loaning purloined Turkish gold to impoverished European nations that were trying to rebuild. Those nations then became indebted and this debt was used to leverage them politically. When the abandoned American gold in the Philippines came up for discussion, and the profit to be made from another war for profit was calculated, and plans for World War II were fast-tracked in the same way that plans for World War II have been fast-tracked now. Another example is provided by the rivalry between the Dutch East India Company and British East India Company. When the Dutch East India Company was forced to relocate following the discovery of its part in the Bottomry Bonds scandal, the British East India Company, supposedly its worst enemy and competitor, came to its rescue and provided it safe haven in New York. Both companies were ultimately owned by the same investors. The municipal corporations in the District of Columbia have played the same good guy bad guy game, and even as the city-operated municipal corporation subcontractor makes final preparation to move to China, the British Crown-operated municipal corporation subcontractor covers their departure from the United States and collaborates on the false claims on abandonment against our nation and our national government, and prepares the smokescreen, World War II, needed to plump up profits and distract public attention away from the economic, financial, and bank issues. We see the same two-party scheme employed by the political parties in this country, with the Republicans and Democrats appearing to be worlds apart, but actually delivering the same ugly results. Our point is that this two sides to everything plan is purposeful and it is consistently used to promote fraud and violence. So is the whole claim on abandonment process constantly employed by banks to steal assets that don't belong to them. We are not deceived. We see the games being played by these municipal corporations. All these seemingly disparate for-profit corporations are operated by the same interests which are deliberately causing all this disruption and corruption in order to unjustly enrich themselves and garner coercive power under color of law. It's past time for those same interests to stop and reflect. This time, we know who they are and what they are doing. We know about their aspiration to plunge the earth into a new age of corporate feudalism, where people would be slaves owned by corporations, instead of the corporations being owned by the people. Our national government is still here and still intact. We are present and in session and we disallow all claims on abandonment for ourselves, and for all the other nations that have been unlawfully occupied by territorial mercenary forces acting under color of law. We wish for peace and consider war a crime, not a pastime, and not a money-making opportunity nor a convenient smokescreen to hide bank fraud. The so-called greatest wealth transfer in human history, that is, a transfer straight into the pockets of the guilty municipal corporations, just hit a snag. We wish for the central banks together with their commercial bank franchises, which are all running as municipal corporations of one species or another, to be forfeited and placed under the control of the national government, where these evils persist. We wish for a revision in favor of the truth and an end to these corporations and an end to corporate feudalism as a model for world government, before it even gets seated. We will not be deceived. Just as the municipal corporations failed their trust, the central banks have failed theirs. None of these corporations have delivered the promised results and services they touted. The municipal corporations have acted as predators upon the people they were supposed to serve, and the central banks have failed to prevent inflation or counterfeiting or bank runs. But they have succeeded in constructing a vast illegal and unlawful commodity rigging scheme that harms world currencies and stock markets, and which consistently injures producers, consumers, and investors alike. There can be no doubt that all of these municipal corporations have functioned unlawfully, and often illegally, too, and that they have failed the test as public service providers. With these issues plainly decided by their own free will and actions, there is no reason for these entities to exist and no reason to argue about it. We wish for them to be either liquidated, as in the case of all the misbegotten federal agencies which have been added to our expenses by our municipal corporation subcontractors without our consensual agreement, or b. forfeited to the control of the respective national governments, so as to best preserve peace and safety of everyone concerned. If any of the other national governments need time to reorganize after a long sleep, we will act as their fiduciaries until they get on their feet and have their traditional government offices back in place. Issued by Anna Maria Riesinger, Fiduciary. The United States of America in care of Box 520994 Big Lake, Alaska 99652. April 17, 2023.